West Ham take on Newcastle this weekend. Big game for both teams, but is it one where Newcastle will be emotionally deflated after what was the most ridiculous fairy tale of an evening at St James's Park against PSG? If you'd said to a Newcastle United fan, okay, you're going to win 4-1 against PSG, first of all, they'd be in shock. And I tell you what, you write down the scorers. I think they go Almiron, Dan Burn, those guys.
Yeah.
There has to be some kind of emotional loss there. Can they cope with that going into a game against a very, very resolute West Ham? Or do you think, I think the things that we've put forward when it comes to our previews at the start of the season and got a bit of critique for, it's now is the moment that we're wondering there may be a drop-off in the league due to the excitement and understandable focus that comes with the Champions League and the group that they were given. Is anything that I'm saying fair here?
It depends if you're talking about an emotional letdown, which there's inevitably going to be, or just lacking concentration, because despite the fact that Newcastle fans are very emotional, it's a very emotional football club, players are very emotional, Eddie Howe's pretty cold. And what he's built this Newcastle team on is being defensively resolute. If you look at their last 5 or 6 games, I think they conceded 1 goal in all competitions. Wow. And so if you're talking about lapse of concentration, that remains to be seen. But I think Eddie Howe will have his Newcastle team ready to play despite the fact that they were on such an emotional high after beating PSG 4-1. As a football fan, I have to apologise to players like Jamal Lascelles, who I thought was done. I was laughing at the idea of him playing for a Newcastle team in the Champions League, but there's a reason why he remains their club captain despite the fact that he wasn't getting into the starting lineup. And now you've got those players who've built up their confidence. I think this Newcastle team can go on from that result at PSG and maybe surprise myself in terms of the season they're going to have, because I wasn't too sure where this Newcastle side would be after overachieving last season. It looks like they're ready to go again and again. So I'm intrigued to see it, but I don't expect there to be much of a drop-off from the performance against PSG.
Yeah, the question mark for me was the squad. I thought the starting 11 was good, but some of those players that I was concerned about being squad players started in that game against PSG and scored screamers. So how much do I know? That balance between the two of playing in Europe, which Newcastle have never done, and actually a lot of the players there have never done before. Eddie Howe in his interview after the game talking about we will be playing 3 games a season for the rest of the season. So when it gets into this churn of Europe League, do you think Newcastle have got it covered with Eddie Howe and the personnel that they've got?
It's difficult to say. Again, at this early stage in the season, it's difficult to say whether or not they can cope with it. But
from being an Arsenal fan, from being an Arsenal fan and being able to see, October, November, December, the churn, when does it hit?
It normally hits, I think, come the end of November.
Right.
When you're about to enter into that winter period, which we know is notoriously difficult as it is. I think that's when it hits you. You've played a few European group games by that point. You're in a place where I think physically you're starting to get a little bit tired, but also mentally.
Psychologically, yeah.
For me, with Newcastle, it's more about the psychological effects of the other night. And listen, it was a great night for Newcastle Football Club. They'll be on cloud 9 for weeks to come. It's not about deflation for me when it comes to Newcastle now. It's about whether they can match those intensity levels, because when
arousal levels, right? I think that's the thing.
That's it. When you hit that high, can you then hit that high again a few days later? And West Ham's a tricky place to go. West Ham is a place where if you're not at it, you can come unstuck. The London Stadium is a place where they can turn on you, the supporters I'm talking about, if you don't perform. But if they see that you're giving it everything, they can get right behind you as well. And I think this is a tough game for Newcastle. They'll be emotionally drained, not in a negative way, but just because of how much the other night meant to them.
Yeah, and I think that's been their superpower to a point, is utilising the crowd, that giving you energy as a person. And I think that's it for me. I think it's both mental fatigue and physical fatigue at some point, I think, could hurt them. And I think with Newcastle in particular, actually probably more the psychological, jet lag of it all, if you know what I mean. And so playing against West Ham, who've started the season very well, have been resolute overall defensively, and are willing to allow Newcastle to have the ball, how do you think that style of game will pose questions for Newcastle?
West Ham, I know firsthand watching Chelsea play against West Ham. Obviously, think about the Brighton versus West Ham game. West Ham don't need a lot of the ball to hurt you. And if they're attacking players, have got their shooting boots on, then West Ham can run up the score on you as well. But it depends on the Newcastle side that turn up. I think if Newcastle are on their P's and Q's, I think they can deal with West Ham even away from home. But West Ham has shown this season that they're a very strong side, also a side contending with European football. And this is Europa League is a big deal for West Ham this season.
So I guess Newcastle do have an extra day, don't they?
Yeah, exactly, which does play into it. But I do back Newcastle to come into this one and get something from London Stadium. I'm predicting 3 points, but it depends on how they line up and depends on who's fit as well. If you look at the Newcastle side that beat PSG, Matt Targett, Jacob Murphy, and Elliot Anderson came off the bench for them. Obviously, they are good players in their own rights, but that doesn't scream a Champions League squad. But Eddie Howe's got his side lined up, and I don't want to continue to doubt Newcastle.
Because it's not working for me.
And the fans come after me online.
Yes.
Just on that point, though, of them having the extra day, obviously Newcastle having that extra day over West Ham, I think that kind of cancels itself out based on the fact that you can make 4 or 5 changes in the Europa League as a Premier League side more often than not and get away with it. You can't do that in the Champions League. And that's where the difference comes. And that's where you see clubs, when they make that jump up, really struggling to cope with the kind of midweek and weekends.
So it's where you're or sort of when you're rotating, because for West Ham they will rotate in this game, whereas Newcastle are going to rotate in the Premier League. You would imagine. Well, I mean, guaranteed, right? I guess the only difference there. So at the top end of the pitch, you're fine, aren't you? Callum Wilson, to come in, proven goal scorer. Down the other end of the pitch, in terms of key matchups, Jared Bowen has started the season absolutely fantastically. He's got 6 goal involvements this season, and he's receiving 4.57 progressive passes per 90 this season. And the big reason for that is he's being allowed to stay a bit higher, a bit wider as well, to give him that opportunity. Because I think last season they kind of went back to basics a little bit, and they've reverted to that even more so. There's a bit of a moneyball midfield there in James Ward-Prowse, who's been really, really good and creative as well, being able to get forward as well. For Dan Burn or Targett, I guess that's the question here. Can either of those cope with Jared Bowen in a game like this, especially at home at West Ham?
I wouldn't be surprised to see Matty Targett come in, especially because of the midweek game. I think he may.
Would you expect Dan Burn to be on the bench or to slot in at centre back?
Might slot in centre back because obviously Botman's out, and I expect Scales to play as well. But he could also rotate him out completely because, like you say, it's an emotionally draining game. He's a Geordie boy himself. Like that was a lot, and you felt it, and you definitely know that's going to take a lot out of the players. Jared Bowen, it's good to see him return to the form of a couple of seasons ago, where he got double figures in goals and assists in the Premier League. Last season, like you say, he was playing a bit more of an auxiliary role, playing central, playing out wide, playing a little bit deeper sometimes for West Ham. And so I feel like he's West Ham's biggest threat. Obviously, we know about the exploits of their other attackers, and we talked about the midfield, how good James Ward-Prowse is. But if West Ham to get anything out of this game, Jared Bowen has to be on it.
Is there another name I didn't chuck in there, likes of Lewis Hall? Would Lewis Hall maybe step in on this one?
Possibly, but I'm not too sure where he stands in terms of the reckoning or the pecking
hierarchy.
order.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think the Jared Bowen point is a big one for West Ham. I think that's a way in for them. Dan Burn is very much a system defender for me. If he's the one that plays in that, being quite a big lad and someone that you look at and think is a centre back, he stops your ability to play those diagonal balls over the top because he's got that aerial presence. What's interesting though is he's only got a tackle success rate of 13% this season, which is the lowest of any Newcastle player to attempt more than one tackle. So
is that why he celebrated when he did that one tackle on Wednesday against Dembele? I mean, I would as well, to be fair.
If you're David Moyes and you're Jared Bowen and Dan Burn is the one you line up against. Now I know he coped brilliantly with the likes of Dembele and Mbappe the other night, but you're looking at isolating him in one-on-one situations. And I think the way Newcastle was set up normally protects him quite well and allows him to tuck in and get close to the centre halves and become almost part of a central defensive unit rather than as an out-and-out left-back. So if Bowen stays high and stays wide, I think he can cause Newcastle problems.
Okay. Prediction time. I'm going to be boring once again because I actually think, I think they could cancel each other out in the sense that West Ham, from an attacking point of view, I think their biggest threat is set pieces. And I think Dan Burn plays partly down to that as well, because Newcastle very strong, both offensively from set pieces, with Kieran Trippier being superb for them as ever. But James Ward-Prowse for West Ham, he's created 22 chances this season, 7 from open play, 12 from set piece scenarios. His conversion rate's 25% as well, which is absolutely amazing. Any striker will be delighted with that. Erling Haaland's conversion rate is 25% this season. So I think in open play, both teams might be a little bit stunted, maybe a little bit jaded, and it could be one where it's a set piece each. I think it will come down to set pieces. I'm going to go for a 1-1 draw. Kweku, what are you saying?
Newcastle leave with something, and I think they leave with all 3 points. I've got a 1-0 Newcastle win.
I think the points will be shared. This has got a draw written all over it for me. 1-1, 0-0, low scoring for me, low scoring draw.